Let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Kaishian. She's a visiting professor of biology at Bard College and the Bard Prison Initiative, and her research focuses on fungal taxonomy, diversity, evolution, symbiosis, and ecology, particularly of the less studied fungal groups, such as the insect-associated, I have trouble with this, Labufiniales. I'm going to say it wrong. She'll tell me. Labus. Labules. She's going to say it. And she's also a co-founder of the International Congress of Armenian Mycologists, which seeks to jointly protect Armenian sovereignty and biodiversity. That's something that I've been very interested in following and reading a little bit about. I think it's I'd like to have a whole nother presentation on like that. I think that could be a whole nother presentation. So yes.
Yeah, I'll touch a little bit on some of those themes, but.
Excellent. Okay, great. And anyway, so Dr. Patty, as I'm now calling her, also studies philosophy of science and queer theory and is exploring how mycology and other scientific disciplines are situated in and informed by our socio-political landscape. And her work, The Science Underground, Mycology as a Queer Discipline, appears in Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience. And her forthcoming book, Forest Euphoria, will be published by Spiegel and Grau. Am I saying that? I just wanted to say it in a fancy accent. I don't know how you really say it. It's probably Spiegel.
Yeah.
Spiegel and Grau. Anyway, very excited about that. It's always really fun when your Myco heroes are writing books and you get to buy them. Maybe we'll have a book party. You know, our club loves to throw book parties. We've had a lot of book party success lately.
I'd be very flattered.
Excellent. Okay, well, I will turn it over to Dr. Patty, and maybe she could start by telling us how to pronounce labules.
Sure. Thanks so much, Annie. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for everyone being here and welcoming me into your evening agenda program. We are really happy to have this time with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me one moment. I pull it back up because I had it up. Okay. Okay, maybe thumbs up if you can see it. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks. I mean, and happy Pride, everyone. It's been an interest, I think actually a little bit of an interesting time. You know, in some ways, not so interesting in a good way. There has been it's an uptick in transphobic and queerphobic policy and discourse. So it's been a little bit of a strange time. I've been working on ideas of this nature for about 4 years now. So I've been, I started presenting on this topic and it's evolved in different ways, but about 4 years ago. And it's been really fascinating to see how the landscape has changed in terms of the interest in mycology that's bloomed or fruited, you could say, in the last couple of years. There's these ebbs and flows of sort of greater and lesser acceptance of the concepts and the attendant realities of queerness in the United States and of course beyond as well. So I came to this work. I have a PhD in mycology, sort of in the strict scientific sense, and I'm a taxonomist specifically. So I'll get into a little bit of my background as a sort of straightforward scientist and mycologist. But I began thinking about also these other dimensions of science and what I would refer to as knowledge production and the production of science during graduate school, because I became really fascinated with the question as to why mushrooms and other fungi were so poorly studied. And I got really interested in philosophy of science and sort of understanding let's take a step back and even think about what is science anyway? And so at the time of putting together some of these ideas, I would say mycology had not yet exploded into the more mainstream awareness. And it's really fascinating to be on this journey to sort of see how that has changed and sort of understand the ways what cultural forces are also driving that acceptance. And just a quick side note, There's a thunderstorm going on right now where I am, thankfully, because we needed the rain. But I don't know if it's going to be very loud or send a lightning bolt that disconnects my internet. So we'll see. But I'm happy that it's raining. So yeah, so I was really fascinated by this sort of, how do we know what we know in science? What are the ways in which science operates in mysterious, sort of under the cover ways? And how do fungi sort of provide us with a vehicle for exploring these sort of social dimensions of science? So my goal as a scientist and as a person in the world is to conduct better and more ethical science. So I consider myself as someone who's very science critical, but ultimately science positive. And by that, I mean that I'm very enthusiastic about, critiquing science in a good faith way. So not just sort of lobbing political, attacks against science, but really getting into the details as to where how can we sort of examine previously unexamined or under-examined, taken for granted for elements of this whole sort of project that science is. And I think that I've observed frequently in my, orbiting of the scientific, academic, institutional worlds, that I would like scientists to be more willing to look upon the field that they're studying and seeing it as something that's situated in this like broader social landscape. I think there's this tremendous pressure in sort of unspoken and sometimes spoken social pressure on scientists to identify as being quote unquote apolitical. And there is this striving for objectivity. But I think that is misguided in many ways. And at best, it's sort of just a bit of a kind of naive approach, but at worst, it's a way of moving through the world in which you unwittingly, or even sometimes somewhat wittingly, carry with you the baggages of the cultural world into your science. So I think it's important for scientists to sort of reflect on how their work is affected by other things that might at first glance seem unrelated to their work. So for example, where does their funding come from? Whose work is being cited? Who is being invited to speak places? Who has teaching positions and tenure and so forth, right? And many other sort of tendrils of those types of things. And then also, I've been sort of motivated to explore mycology as a queer discipline, as I've termed it, because I saw in fungal biology all of these really inspiring elements of their organization in life that I think we as human beings can look towards for inspiration, and sort of reimagining a world that is, less troubled by the harms that we currently face. So I see fungi as demonstrating these possibilities that are non-extractive. They're sort of fluid and community-oriented and life-giving and non-binary and all of these things. So I'll explore some of those elements today. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done. So as I mentioned, I'm a taxonomist. I look for, name, and describe new species of fungi. Over the past I started my PhD in 2015, and since then I've described about 13 species of fungi, all within the order Labulbiniales. So that's the mouthful. But I'll tell you something, because I know when Annie was giving the ID table, she hesitated a little bit with some pronunciation, but I just want to say that Latin is a dead language, and you can say it. There's a lot of ways to say it, and no one can really prove you wrong. So I just want people to feel confident. They can just put something out there, and if like any decent person's not going to make fun of you for that. So, but nonetheless, the word Labulbiniales is a little bit hard to say, so we actually just call them labules often. And I'm actually one of only about 6 or so professional mycologists who focuses on this entire order. It's an enormous group. It has, we think, up to 70,000 different species in existence, but of that, we've only described about 2,100 species. So we have, like pretty much every area of fungal taxonomy, a lot of work to do. But I also do fungal diversity inventories around the world. I've had a lot of opportunities to do work in Central and South America, and increasingly developing partnerships and work in Armenia, which is the area that my family ancestors are from. But labules, this talk isn't really about them, but I'll just quickly say they're insect and arthropod associated ascomycetes. So the photos on the top center, the bottom left, and the bottom right, those are all examples of labules. And we call them parasites, but there's actually a little bit of debate around their exact impact on the host. Some seem to cause what we would say a metabolic drag on the host, but others do not seem to do that, although there's just very little research on them in general. So it's very not unsettled what their exact relationship with their hosts is in all cases. Again, there's 70,000 potential species out there. So what's true for one is very unlikely true for all in all cases. So I'm fascinated by this group because they're so neglected, but they're the most diverse insect associated lineage of fungi. So they're in the same phylum as like Ophiocordyceps, cordyceps groups, but actually not that's the only taxonomic rank they share with that with the cordyceps. People always ask me about them, and I don't study them as in an official way, but of course I do love them and find them fascinating. But you don't have to travel to Central or South America to find these fungi. Like many other organisms, diversity is highest in tropical habitats. But you can find these fungi and some of the others that I've featured here all around, the North America, the Northeast, and I'm in New York. So, for example, this mucor species on the center left that was growing on on a cucumber in my refrigerator. So that I didn't have to travel very far for that. But I really just love fungal biodiversity all in all. That has brought me into really interesting places. Oops, I forgot I had that slide. So see, this is a cluster of 4 species within the genus Prolix andromyces, which 4 of these species I've described with my PhD advisor, Dr. Alex Weir. And on the right, this is a lady beetle, and this is hosting the fungus Hesperomyces. So actually, this is another one. The Hesperomyces on lady beetles is something you very well could find in Washington, D.C. And many of these fungi are not visible to the naked eye and require a dissecting microscope to see on the insect body. But this one, Hesperomyces, is one that you can usually see with the naked eye and definitely with just a hand lens. And from that vantage, they look like sort of these amber outgrowths that can be sort of popping out through the elytra of the beetle, or also around its like face and sensory organs. So keep an eye out for those on your beetles or lady beetles. But my work has brought me, as I mentioned, to a lot of, I've had a really kind of quite the honor to travel and work in different places and different contexts. And, I got into mycology because for many reasons, but one was that I wanted to be outside. I feel most at home in the woods. And so this is a photo from a trip I took in 2018 to the Ecuadorian Andes with a National Geographic funded project. Actually, I heard that Rue van de Grift gave a talk for your club not too long ago, or maybe a couple of years ago, and he spoke about this project. He was the PI, the principal investigator on the grant that took a team of scientists to the Ecuadorian Andes to inventory biodiversity in a region that has been threatened by a Canadian mining company and is at risk of destruction. And there is an indigenous-led effort to protect this land. And the sort of spirit of the grant was to ally ourselves as scientists to this indigenous-led movement and provide biodiversity data as to support the efforts to protect the land. Basically, if we could say like there are, X number of rare species or endemic species or species that have never been described before, new to science species, that would bolster the argument that the land should not be destroyed. And this project was quite an adventure in a very literal way. Like this was this photo of this little lab setup was a 9-hour hike from the nearest research station, which in turn was like a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. And then we trekked in all of our own stuff, and there wasn't an existing infrastructure that we stayed at. We just built a base camp in the middle of the forest with tarps and whatnot. We did have mules helping us carry a lot of our equipment. And I'm still processing a lot of the data that we collected because it got very much delayed by COVID, getting the samples back from Ecuador and so forth. But one thing that I have a lot of mixed feelings about this effort. It was all good in a lot of ways, but one thing there's something kind of a complicated feeling in me arose during this work, which was that there two things. One is that it felt, I don't want to sound really pessimistic, but there was something very discouraging about laboring so intensely. In this case, I was collecting insects. So I am studying both the insects and their associated fungi. And there was something so small, I suppose, about what I was doing and the creatures that I was focused on. And it was so kind of hard to ignore that the companies and their, profit incentives obviously cared nothing about insects or insect associated fungi. And nonetheless, I was there sort of paying a lot out of pocket even, and putting myself through this incredibly rigorous, I spent 10 days in the forest, and it was raining the entire time. Everything was soaking wet, I would go to sleep in a wet sleeping bag and wake up wet, and it was constantly, and it was kind of amazing, but it was also incredibly difficult. And there was something, I don't know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the science of it became abundantly clear to me, and this was already a thought that was developing for years prior, but it became kind of crystallized that science alone is not going to be enough to stop the sort of destruction of the planet. And this effort has largely succeeded in protecting the land, and that's because it was led by indigenous people, and there was an enormously powerful grassroots resistance that we coupled with, and I think our work was ultimately cited in the court case that granted us a protection to this land, which is, I think, really good. But I think it's so important to emphasize that science alone I don't believe would have accomplished that. And I think that, we got some buzzy, National Geographic funding, and that put pressure on people to maybe do the right thing. But I think ultimately, this was sort of this moment for me where I was like, there is for me in my career, no going forward as a scientist without being very intentional and involved in earth justice and earth liberation and associate projects for the sort of, liberatory projects for people in many categories, right? So I think that this is sort of, I guess, maybe the central nugget of the talk that I want to share today, which, is that I think science is a massively important tool, but we are alive in a time that is contending with such massive injustice and going to head with really kind of predatory alignments we need to, I don't really see how science alone is going to navigate us through climate change, even though climate change is often sort of discussed as a scientific problem. So this kind of brings me into this, so the full elements of philosophy of science that I'm really interested in talking about and grappling with. So one thing that came up for me as a graduate student is like this kind of question of like who asks the questions and who tells the story. So when you're thinking about science and what we know, what the scientific method has revealed to us, always when you ask a question or carry out the investigative processes of conducting science, you're a person, a human being, making sense of the world using your culturally specific tools, and asking questions that are filtered through your culturally specific sort of, lens, right? So there are these ways in which the person who asks the question and the person who gets to then interpret the results of that question and the sort of data that come along with it, and then analyze that data and synthesize it and explain it. All of this is what I would say is culturally mediated, right? It's something that's passing through the lenses or the apparatuses of being in the world and being a person in a human society, right? So when I think about science, I think of it as ideally an equal opportunity, investigative, methodological tool. And ideally is doing a lot of work here because oftentimes and mostly it doesn't really play out like this, right? I've noticed a lot of people are very, very hesitant to call themselves scientists unless they have graduate degrees or even usually PhDs. But really anyone can deploy the tool of science, right? It's a way of asking, making observations, learning stuff about the world, asking questions, carrying out, this investigation in a way that can be replicated by someone else, right? And I think this is what gives science its tremendous power and its lasting influence over hundreds and hundreds of years. It's because it's really a robust tool because of its adaptability and it's the way it can be deployed by many different types of people in many different settings, and getting at all these different fundamental questions about the universe, right? And again, what I love about science is this idea of it's sort of this like collective project in its ideal form. It's this sort of almost utopic idea that we can collectively understand the universe by participating in deploying this tool. It's like this idea of like together we can understand the universe. The universe is infinitely complicated, but if I ask this small question about fungal associated insects, what is infinitely unknown becomes infinity minus one, right? It's this way of sort of like chipping away at this like vast mystery that we all find ourselves in. And importantly, though, I think it's a way of knowing, but it's one way of knowing. And I think this is where scientists are likely to find themselves getting very cagey and defensive. There's a strong emphasis in the scientific community to assert that science is the way of knowing. It is the singular way of knowing. Everything else is not just like less than, but even, there's a lot of derogatory terms used to describe ways of thinking or knowing that are not scientific, right? It's quackery, it's pseudoscience, it's I don't know, just like dumb, right? But I think what I want to emphasize is that again, as a scientist, I love science and I think it's very powerful, but we don't do a service to its power and its utility if we pretend it's the only way that we can sort of look at the world, move through the world. And especially if we export that idea onto other people and other cultures without doing the work of examining the ways in which we've actually been carrying around faulty information. So this is going back to the idea of making science actually better and more accountable. And I think that there's this impulse among scientists to, if you kind of get political, quote unquote, there's this kind of guardedness that pops up. And I do think there's a lot of reasons that exists. And of course we do live in a climate right now that is very polarized, and science is definitely under attack in a very bad faith way, kind of constantly. So I do think people get defensive for that reason. But within the context of talking about science between scientists or between, again, in a good faith way, scientists should be open to understanding that there are limits to what we know, there are limits to what we can know, at least given our current tools, and there are certainly were limits to what we knew prior to now. And all of this needs to be examined and reconciled with the fact that so much of the science has been built in this sort of tradition of Western, Euro, and European American society and culture. So I love thinking about mycology in this sort of space, right? So we see, and again, this has sort of changed since I began writing and thinking about this. So I'm interested, I would love that, maybe towards the end, people, if you're newer to mycology, maybe in the last year or two, you've joined the group or something, love to hear maybe if you have a different, or how you see mycology now. But for the up, and even now, this mycology is still, as it compared to other organisms, deeply underfunded, deeply, underinvested in, and rarely studied academically. I think I heard from people, from Gabriella, from the Fungal Diversity Survey, so that there are 200 professional mycologists, I think, in the US. I haven't checked that outside of her telling me that, but it kind of sounds right. And then, that's compared to thousands of botanists and zoologists. I'll maybe link this at the end, maybe someone can remind me, but there's a paper just came out that gives a nice breakdown of like dollars spent on different organisms, and it shows the ratio of plant biological research to fungal biological research. So if someone can remind me at the end, I'll link that in the chat. But, becoming a mycologist, beginning studying mycology in like 2010, it was really not common. And like many people were very put off by the fact that I had told them I was studying mushrooms. People thought I was going to die from exposure to poisonous things. And there was all sorts of sort of questions about why I was doing it. And sort of the assumptions that I was just in it because of the psychedelics or the, or something else more insidious than that even. Mycology has sort of been this group of organisms that's been sort of denied full consideration in our scientific practice for hundreds of years. But also I'm again, thinking about what I said in the beginning of why I sort of got interested in fungi, it's not just because no one studied them and no one cared, but they also, to me, demonstrated something that was really inspiring. And I felt a kinship towards them that brought me into studying them. And that was that they had this, sure, they were weird and like maybe, unexpected and a little bit, even uncomfortable at times, but they showed me this sort of disruptive possibility, ways in which we could imagine our own biology in the world, our own social systems in the world. And these are both kind of elements of queerness. I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on queer theory in a moment. So just maybe hang on to this for a second. But mycology sort of, the rest of this work in queer mycology is sort of articulating that mycology challenges scientific paradigm and helps us sort of deconstruct and question sort of central tenets of both science and of Western philosophy and thought and Western culture. Fungi offer us, and their study offer us these kind of disruptions to the binary conception that we often view the world like nature, within nature, so plants versus animals. I mean, and a lot of you here probably, of course, are very familiar that there are many other kingdoms, but actually a lot of people move through the world sort of thinking, is this a plant or an animal, right? And fungi, being that they're more closely related to animals than plants, offer this other category, this like sort of hybridized multimodal way of being. You've probably heard that a lot of fungi don't have binary mating arrangements. So some do have like a quote unquote male and a quote unquote female, like some of the labules that I study, but many have all sorts of other different arrangements. They can have up to 23,000 sexes, as in the case of Schizophilum commune or the common splitgill, which I was the fungus on my cover slide, which is a for sure queer icon. And then we also have, many different things in between. So in terms of like what is a normal sexual makeup of these fungi in general, there isn't really normal, right? There are many ways of being, and all of these things lend themselves to the diversity that we see around us. They also challenge this idea of like discrete organismal structure. So much of Western science is about thinking of things in a linear way, right? It's about this sort of process of atomizing the world around us, breaking it down into component parts and creating little boxes that we put around them to understand them. And I do that as a taxonomist. I like to, sometimes it's very satisfying to be able to put something in a box and understand what it is and call it, by its proper name and these types of things. But fungi sort of challenge our ability to do that because of the ways in which they form intimate symbiotic partnerships and with all manner of other beings on Earth. So many of you are likely very familiar with mycorrhizal fungi and also the fungi in our microbiome. And they begin to prompt us to challenge this question of what is the sort of how do we even understand the idea of an individual, right? If, for example, the human body we know that there are more fungal and bacterial cells in our body than there are human cells. What is this, like, how do we even sort of make sense of the human as apart from all of that? Is our evolutionary journey as humans even understandable or even possible without these fungal and also bacterial connections that we've been interacting with for millions and millions of years? So it starts to make, and all of these things are starting to become more mainstream, but these very facts have actually been very problematic for institutional science, right? And many in the academy have been very reluctant to pay much mind to these ideas because they're not just simple stating of facts, right? They're actually prompting us to re-examine all sorts of other things. Like the more you look, the more you realize that these are invitations to sort of question what we've taken for granted as scientific knowledge. And lastly, here I'm talking about, also the methodologies that mycology has relied on. Often because it's not something that's studied in formal settings, we have a huge number of these, like this group, a mycological society that is located outside of an institution. These are, sort of just people-led groups, interest groups that are curiosity driven and arise out of the sort of lack of study that's offered in institutional settings. And also we do in the field of mycology often use a lot of sort of non-traditional methods for acquiring knowledge. We don't often work in the same standardized way that a lot of other disciplines work in, because we are looking for fungi that exist in these sort of more cryptically and more subversively in our landscapes. So I know a lot of you know this stuff, so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I just want to situate us like, okay, so we're talking about fungi. Sometimes I give versions of this talk to people who are not in a mycological society. So they always are sometimes wondering, okay, well, what is a fungus? So I'm not going to get into it now, but I do love pointing out this image, which is from 2016, I believe, but it's a tree of life, a phylogenetic tree. And all the way in the bottom right-hand corner, there's this greenish branch of the tree that includes fungi and also animals. It's the eukaryota, basically plants, fungi, animals, amoebae. And we are in the opisthocanta. By we, I mean humans and animals and also fungi and amoebae, or it's just like slime molds, for example, are in the opisthocanta, all the way in this bottom right-hand corner. So we're really closely related, actually. And, fungi, these other, sorry, I'm just trying to move my little box. Okay. Fungi are also collectively identifiable based on these shared characteristics, right? They're all, I won't go through all of these now, but these are, if you're a scientist and talking about what is a fungus, these are the terms you would use to describe them, right? But there's also ways in which, and then we have to understand the ways in which we as human beings and members of a culture are viewing organisms, right? So a scientist might have these very technical terms to describe an organism, but there's all sorts of other associations that we carry into the practice of viewing an organism, right? So in the case of fungi, historically, and in Western sort of dominated cultures, there is these other associations. We see them as poisonous, disease, degenerate, deadly, gross, and weird, right? These are all things that I've heard a million times, especially before a couple of years ago. Whenever I would tell someone I was a mycologist, I would get such a spectrum of reactions. Like some people were just like, didn't even know what to do with their face. Like some people were really just kind of put off and like, okay, changing the subject now. Other people were like, would ask me about the psychedelic ones straight away, which I have no problem talking about. I think they're fascinating. I'm very passionate actually about psychedelic medicine and decriminalization, but it's not what I study. And it's kind of like asking if someone was like, are you, if you said you were a botanist, and it would be sort of like someone being like, oh, so do you smoke marijuana? It's like, I mean, it's fine if you do, that's completely fine. But like, it's just kind of as absurd as that, right? Because we're talking about millions and millions of species here. And I don't mean to shame anyone, but it's just like when you're constantly dealing with it, can be a little tiring. And then of course, there's always like questions about, are you safe? Are you, why are you doing this? Are you a witch? These are the types of like things that the responses that I would get. And again, it's starting to shift, but these have been the dominant responses that I have received over my career. But then we have this other way of thinking about fungi, and one that's, I think, continuing to grow and myceliate into the sort of ethos and zeitgeist. But we can see fungi also as terraforming bodies, right? These are organisms that enabled the transition of plants from their marine habitat in which they evolved to land, thereby giving rise to all of the biodiversity in our landscapes that we're now so familiar with, including giving, the cradle for human evolution and the evolution of flowers and birds and, other mammals, right? So fungi, through their partnerships with plants, enabled this process to happen. They're literally world building, right? They're also trans-individual. And by that, I mean, they encourage us to see ourselves, or they remind us to see ourselves as connected in many different ways, in many different layers to the organisms around us all the time, right? So in the literal sense of the fungi that live in our stomachs and in our digestive tracts and brain even, and like to also the fact that the forests are supported by a network of fungi, like mycorrhizal networks, right? And I'm sitting here and giving this talk. I'm in this sort of the Hudson Valley, central New York region. And today the sky was completely smoky from fires in Canada. And this, for the second time this month, that was true. Like earlier, or I guess at the beginning of May, there's fire smoke all the way from Alberta, Western Canada. And then, just a month later, there's this fire from Ontario. And it's like, these reminders of the global connectivity and the shared fate of it all, right? I think, and fungi can kind of help us think about that. They also are remediators. So they can break down dead or dying they can do that. That's saprotrophic. They can break down dead, heavy metals, or they can accumulate heavy metals in their tissues, and then we can use them sort of like a sponge to then put in biohazardous waste, and they can decompose hydrocarbons from fossil fuels and all sorts of other things, as you've probably heard about. So they can offer this potential as well. And I think ultimately they are our shared ecological history. And for me, it's important not just to see fungi as metaphor, not just to see them as things that can clean up our waste and our problems. And it's important to me not to situate them entirely as a savior either, but actually also as sort of, I like to say, co-conspirators in the tree of life, right? They're companion species. They're organisms that we share a planet with, and we should care for them whether or not they can clean up our garbage, right? And in fact, a lot of them need stewardship and protection. So I just like to offer that sort of reminder as well. And this is sort of this, but they're thinking of them as in the red box, this box of how they've been historically treated. This is where I start to link it with this idea, so we have the term in mycology, mycophobia, right? What this sort of unreasonable fear of mushrooms. A lot of people think you cannot touch any mushroom, or that even, you can't even get it close to your face and smell it. And they're just this very paralyzed with fear sort of approach that's taught to you starting for many of us starting as children, right? And it's just simply overblown and not true. Of course, there are poisonous mushrooms, but there are also many poisonous plants. And we are comfortable eating not just plants that are like, that we're even comfortable as a society eating plants that you can only eat part of. If you eat the stem, it's poisonous, but if you eat the fruit, it's fine. Like, we can navigate that with plants, but but people are petrified of fungi. And meanwhile, there are more poisonous plants, and certainly many poisonous plants to touch, more so than fungi. So it's just not really a reasonable fear. It's overblown, and that's the phobia part, right? It's not that none of them will hurt you. It's that it's just you don't need to approach them all through this very narrow pathologizing lens. And you see this, like, there's so much evidence of this throughout Western culture. And I pulled a couple of quotes. This is from Emily Dickinson. She has this is a subset of a poem she wrote that's titled The Elf of Plants. So that's sort of a reference to a Linnaean, one of the founders of our modern taxonomic system, who gave us the binomial nomenclature system, the two-name system. So like, Homo sapien, right? This is a reference to the fact that he categorized fungi as being lower plants. So they were seen as, plants just that were not so good at being plants. They were bad plants. They were plants that were stupid at being plants. And they were put in this like sort of category of like lesser than, right? And so anyway, the title of The Elf of Plants. So she writes, had nature any outcast face, could she a son condemn? Had nature an Iscariot, the mushroom it is him. And here, basically, what she's saying is, like, so Iscariot, Judas, the Iscariot, that's actually a biblical reference. This is a reference to the disciple Judas, who infamously betrayed Jesus, and which led to his crucifixion. So what she's saying here is actually like super dramatic. It's basically that mushrooms are not only just like bad, but they're like Judas, and that they're defiling not only like this like natural order, but like God and like the that which is holy, right? So it's a very dramatic, heavy-handed disgust that she's working with there. And then there's also this excerpt from Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes. So these are both, European writers. Sickly, festered, monstrous, foul pustules, filthy crop, death, all this. I'm not reading the whole thing, but just sort of, and really what he's talking about here is like, so we're talking about an autumn field, forest sort of area. And this is his sort of description of a field in the fall, right? If we get pretty down to it. So monstrous, disgusting, rotting. So fungi are just living their lives, decomposing dead and dying organic matter, making life possible for all of us. And this is the sort of way that they're perceived. Now, of course, I don't expect everyone to know all of the science about mycology, right? I'm not saying that you should be born knowing this. If it's not taught, you don't know it. But nonetheless, what we have here is a little bit of this idea of like a runaway train, right? When there are cultural assumptions that are widespread, sometimes the science doesn't work to upend that. Sometimes the science, no one actually thinks to ask the question, or few people do, and maybe those who do decide to kind of go against cultural norms and ask particular questions are not funded, or they're not hired, or they're ridiculed or condemned, etc. Right? But I think there's this sort of assumption that science will just ultimately always work itself out, and we'll always learn and understand and know more. But that actually is not inevitable, right? If everyone is thinking that fungi are pathogens, that they're dead and they're diseased and they're going to kill you, and they're just causing havoc and defiling our holy sites, then fewer people are going to ask, well, what if they are life-giving? What if they are terraforming bodies? What if they're showing us all of these possibilities of mutualism and symbiosis, and actually kind of governing all of the cyclical processes that we have come to fundamentally rely on as animals, as human species, right? And so these questions about fungi are starting to get asked now. And I mean, people were asking these questions, but very few people have been taking it seriously. And this is sort of, the material outcome of this is non-trivial. It's actually not really an academic exercise, right? It's like, if we don't actually study fungi enough, or fund them enough, then they go extinct, right? Then they become they're lost. They're not being conserved. They're not being, understood for all their potential life-giving capacity and ecological function. So these things are not actually just sort of this sort of academic study. There's something very material about approaching the world through this perspective, right? And when I think about when I look at science, and I'm sort of exploring the history of science and using mycology as a case study to do so, I like to describe seeing cultural fingerprints, right? So in the texts that you read, in the citations, if you follow the citation rabbit holes and trains, and you find these fingerprints, right? And of course, who was conducting most of the science for several hundred years? But they were wealthy, white Europeans, and typically men. This is a cultural perspective, right? It is not a universal perspective to have all of those identifiers. And at the time, we were talking about, women were explicitly excluded from the formal participation in science, but women were also traditionally the keepers of a lot of ecological knowledge in Europe, and of course, around the world. So, they were very intentional about gatekeeping. Going back to those questions I proposed, like who asks the question, who tells the story, this was very intentionally limited to a very small subset of people, not just all white men even, but you had to be wealthy, you had to have some certain access, right? And this was to I think all of our detriment, and it's not this is not just something of the past, right? This is the foundation, this is the bedrock, and not all of this has been excavated or mined, and in fact, very little of it has. And of course, associated with this culture is also Christianity, which wasn't always a Western religion, but became adopted into Western Europe. And then there was sort of this imperialized variety of Christianity that became exported around the world. And I'm really fascinated by this one. Really, there's some biblical scholars talk about a particular translation issue that I think is so fascinating, and which is that the word dominion, to have dominion over, right, is something that is really embedded in our legacy in the United States. It was the sort of the canon upon which Western expansion was justified. The papal bulls, these decrees from the Pope to expand and colonize and imperialize and convert people to Christianity and to have dominion over the land. These are things that are super deeply integral to this sort of variety of Western Christianity. And some biblical scholars propose that the word dominion was actually a possible mistranslation for a word that was more closely related to the word of stewardship, which would invite not domination, which is the shared root of the word dominion, but stewardship, more like tending to a garden, right? A way of cultivating, a way of like shepherding perhaps, but something that is more gentle and doesn't rely on dominance. So you find, these types of ways of thinking are really deeply embedded in so many areas of biology, not just in mycology. So for example, this idea of hierarchy, dominion, right, to create power over another based on race or gender or class or orientation. These are things that were the foundational tenets of the eugenics movement as well, which was something that had profound scientific buy-in. I think a lot of people, when they think about eugenics, they think about Nazis and they think about really extremist movements, which of course utilize these ideas. But I think what's lost and I think scientists have not done enough to contend with is that these were actually deeply scientific movements. These were eugenic societies were often also conservation societies. And that's kind of another a topic for another talk. But by conservation, I mean the wilderness conservation movements in the United States were often working in direct partnership with eugenic societies. So these things are really kind of constantly, we are butting up against these ideas all the time, but people, I think, like to avoid thinking about it because it's really uncomfortable and it's a big problem, right? I'm going to skip this a little bit, but so this is a tree of life. And now we know, I showed you another tree of life in the beginning that is using the science of phylogenetics, right? The way of understanding relatedness between species and taxonomic groups through genetic information, morphology, and ecological life history traits. But this idea of a tree is sort of dates back for a while, and this is now not an accurate scientific tree, but it had elements of this sort of desire to sort and to classify based on the Linnaean system. And of course, at the top of the tree, you see man, humans, but definitely specifically men also. And then you have like other primates and gorillas and orangutans and such. And then you go lower and lower in the tree, and you get you get to reptiles and then amphibians, and then you have like worms, and then all the like all this other amoebae at the bottom, and this is the way of sort of orienting the world that was a dominant way of scientific thought for until Darwin, really, which is this idea that humans were the pinnacle of life on Earth. And prior to our understanding of evolution, this was sort of how we related to one another in this Western European construct. This was people were closest to God. That's why they were at the top of the tree. They were most godlike. And everything else was not as good. They were further from God, right? They were beneath, and this was this dominion hierarchy. And it began to inform how we relate to all other species, and certainly how we relate to each other as humans as well. The internal species hierarchies of men over women, white people over people of color, able-bodied people over disabled people, and so forth. Right. So these are these ideas this was like the scientific concept. And I think we like to think, oh, okay, well, this isn't scientific anymore. But what's tricky about saying that phrase, this isn't science anymore, is that, well, it was once science. So how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of the fact that science had brought us to this place where we've created a hierarchy where humans are entitled to destroy the earth on the basis of the fact that they are better than the species that they share a planet with? And I had the distinct privilege of, when I was a grad student, as studying with Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is a botanist and a member of the Potawatomi Nation, and she's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, and she's a professor at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where I did my PhD. And I was lucky enough to attend a lot of her workshops and go to readings that she offered and read a lot of her works. And she also served on my PhD committee. And so in studying, I myself am not a person who has any indigenous roots to the United States, or so-called the United States, but I've been a student of traditional ecological knowledge for some years now. So a lot of what I'm doing in this sort of application of queer theory is this idea is also informed by and inspired by traditional ecological knowledge. So this quote by Cason Ghost Horse, who's a member of the Lakota, right, he talks about the word dominion, which I think is a really fascinating quote. He writes that rational mind is the human living within the hierarchy of a box that seeks to capture it through its own narcissistic addiction to the anthropocentrism of a society or a people who hold themselves up as somehow more grandiose than others in that box of conscience. It deadens the intuitive or non-dogmatic life. This is where the separation begins, with a concept and a word that doesn't exist within many intuitive languages, such as the Lakota. That word is domination. So here he's really talking about this idea that like even the very concept of domination didn't exist in Lakota society and in their language, meaning this idea of domination is actually one that's very culturally located. The idea that you could have and take advantage of power over another being is something that is not like a universal truth of being a human, right? This is something that's a cultural artifact and was constructed in particular cultural ways. And I think that this is really revealing because I think even those of us who are very science-minded or those of us who are very, try to do the work of, being anti-imperial or anti-colonial, you still end up affected by the culture that is dominant because it's, been forced upon you. But I think this is something to turn to when we think about moving into a world, when we think about climate change and all of the liberation efforts that are necessary to achieve a more just world. I think we need to draw inspiration, and not just inspiration, but action from the idea that that it is necessary to undo this hierarchy and think of ourselves in the evolutionary framework that is actually scientific, which is that we are not more evolved or more entitled to this earth than any other being, and of course, not least of all the fungi. And I know I'm this could go on for so much longer, and I'm not going to subject anyone to that. So I left this a little bit towards the end on purpose, because I think queer theory is a fascinating framework to work through, but I wanted to lay out these ideas first, because there's not, queer theory is just one way, it's one sort of lens through which you can approach the sort of the various points that I'm trying to make here, which is about we need a new way of being, which is maybe not new so much as, simultaneously ancient and newly conceived, right? But so queer theory is, it has its roots in feminist and gay and lesbian studies. And it sort of was a way of a body of work that stemmed from those disciplines. But fundamentally, queer theory, it's not so much about sex. I think a lot of people, when you talk about queerness, are assuming you're going to be talking about specifically like sex acts or something. I mean, of course, that's part of the conversation. But more fundamentally, it's about this dichotomy of normative and deviant categories that we construct in the world around us all of the time, right? We think about things as being what is normal, what is not normal, what is deviant, what is good, what is consistent with our norms, and what is a departure from them. And queer theory seeks to sort of ask, well, who decides? Who made those boxes? Who made those determinations? And why? And how are they a function of power? So queer theory fundamentally is working with power. It's working about asking who has the power to frame something as normal, who has the power to frame something as deviant, and how do we wrest that power from them? And I think queer theory and queer movements are fundamentally about dismantling systems of power which are almost always inherently unjust. And part of that, central to that, is this sort of rejection of essentialist categories of sexuality, right? Just that heteronormativity is the unspoken, so the normativity of it is what is the problem. Not being heterosexuality is not a problem inherently, of course, but it is the fact that it's assumed and projected onto everyone, and that if you act outside of that, there are serious consequences, sometimes life or death consequences. And then there's all sorts of attendant sort of cultural artifacts that go along with heteronormativity, such as who gets to have a family, who gets recognized as being a parent. Do you have to have children to be recognized as a family? Do you have to have biological families to be recognized, for relationships to be valued? All sorts of things like this. Queer theory seeks to unpack all of that. And I think tying this back to mycophobia, queerphobia, there's a lot of parallels here, right? That organisms and bodies that are difficult to neatly categorize, something that becomes a subject of fear often in someone who's encountering that, and it creates insecurity. And because you suddenly maybe realize you don't have control over the situation, or you don't know what to expect. And fear and insecurity often then leads to revulsion and hatred and sometimes violence, right? So in our society, what we are kind of conditioned to, if we are afraid of something, or if we're unfamiliar with something, to be afraid of it. And then that often leads to violence and to rejection, or not necessarily bodily violence, but often social violence and harms as well, right? And so for so long, fungi have operated in this space that the way that they grow, the way that they pop up without prediction, the way that you can't quite pin them down as to what they are they plant, are they animal? They're kind of connected to other things, but they're also sort of, okay, they're here growing, but then they're somewhere else another day. Some of them are poisonous, sure, but often they're just sort of operating in this space that Western culture, for complex reasons, has learned to fear and to reject. And a lot of that fear and rejection does date to like early agricultural days, where fungi were often, pathogens. And as we were expanding our farming and our agricultural, and particularly our monocultures, fungi were often sort of a threat to that structure, a threat to the development of sort of these massive sites of monoculture, right? And that part of that is their history of then becoming pathologized. And of course, a lot of the times when you study fungi, you are housed in the plant pathology department. So technically my PhD is in forest pathology and mycology. So mycology was in the forest pathology umbrella. When I did my postdoc at Purdue University, we were in the plant pathology program. I did happen to study plant pathogens there, the rust fungi, but all of the fungal biology, regardless of whether you were studying a pathogen or not, was housed in this like sort of category of plant pathology. And that's how it's been approached, right? These fungi have been pathologized. So people were much more likely to ask the question, how is this fungus dangerous? How can we eradicate it? How can we control it and kill it? What pesticide or fungicides can we develop that can, enable us to make our monocultures bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger? And less often are the questions being asked, such as, how is this forest sustained by this fungus? How are our bodies medically supported by the fungal diversity within us? And these are, again, not immaterial. It actually affects what we literally know, right? If we approach fungi as being dangerous and deadly, we will ask questions about that. And of course, some of them are, right? So it's not that it's not true always. It's just that we've only asked those questions proportionally. And therefore, that's what we know about them. And I think that this is sort of the takeaway, right? That science is a social project. It is informed by our experiences. And I think people are afraid of talking about that because they're afraid they're going to open science up to so much criticism. But science is being criticized anyway. There are already just really bad faith attacks happening constantly anyway. If we don't have these conversations as scientists, we are certain to just repeat the harms of the past. And lo and behold, we're seeing an insurgence of the eugenicist movement. We're seeing more and more people who are counter to what many scientists would like to believe, that are not dumb, people who are scientifically literate, deciding to leverage scientists in ways that are evil and insidious. I think a lot of scientists like to say, like, oh, they like to paint these people as extremists who don't know science. And it's actually, well, some of them have master's degrees in genetics, and they're working on thinking about ways of proving, race as a biological construct, and proving, the sort of negative racial stereotypes as being elements of our biology. And these are questions that are going to become more and more prominent going forward. So, there's a lot more to say here, and I'm going to skip. But I think I'll end on this final analogy. So, from Ricky Ann Wilchins, who is a gender theorist or a queer theorist that I've been inspired by, they gave this analogy about discourse. So discourse being like sort of how we talk about the world and what we're thinking about, and how we construct sort of our society and our social norms. And so they talk about how discourse is a cookie cutter. So when you talk about something, and giving language to something, that is what you say about it, and how you say it is a cookie cutter. And gender is the dough. So the shape of the cutter tells you more about the cutter than it does the dough, right? So if you're talking about gender and you're using the sort of gender stereotypes that we've inherited for hundreds of years in Western culture, that's telling you about Western culture. It's not necessarily telling you about sort of this like deeper, more fundamental human experience, right? And I like to extend this analogy to science. So I like thinking about science and sort of the methodologies of science as a cutter. And the dough is everything that can be learned, right? So the dough is the universe, and the cutter is the questions that we ask about it. And similarly here, the cutter is shaped to accommodate, the questions of the scientists who are asking them, and not necessarily the universe behind that. And when it comes to fungi, we've constantly been asking questions that are based on the biologies of other organisms, that are based on the biologies of our capitalist system, or the realities of our capitalist system. So for example, how fungi operate in monocultures and in massive farmscapes, and sort of just the general realities and biologies of non-fungal organisms. We're trying to learn about fungi by asking questions in these particular contexts. And because of that, we've for hundreds of years greatly limited what we know about them. And that is part of why now, we're, I think, seeing this surge of interest. I don't think that's totally coincidental with these other, the surge of interest in other sort of traditional ecological knowledge systems. For example, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer was actually written in like 2013 or 14, but it's been in the last 2 years that the book hit I think it's like 500,000 sales. And there, I don't think that this is sort of coincidental, that fungi are also becoming sort of fascinating to people, and people are opening themselves up to it. And I think it's also not coincidental that we're grappling, heavily with race in this country, with climate change, bearing down on us. And all of these things are ways in which people are thinking about the possibilities of living in this planet, right? And of course, also, up until, I would say up until a few months ago, I felt really confident saying, and queer rights have also been improving, and maybe the acceptance of fungi is also, related to this sort of way of accepting many other ways of being. But we are now grappling with that heavy backlash against, particularly against our trans siblings. So, this gets a little complicated there. But nonetheless, I am excited about where the newfound interest in mycology, and I'm excited to continue to adapt, my thinking and speaking around this to accommodate that. So I want to, again, skip, give you some figures. This is the very last slide, I promise. Just some of the material, outcomes of not caring about fungi for hundreds of years. So we think there's at least 3 million species of them. There's estimates that put that number way higher, like 20 million species, but it's millions for sure. And only about 597 species of fungi have been evaluated for placement on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List. And most of that has happened in the last 5 years. But that compares to 25,000 species of plants and over 68,000 species of animals that have been evaluated. And there are a fraction of the number of plants than there are fungi. And there, a lot of these animals are also mammals and vertebrate animals. And so a lot of the animal diversity that's also neglected is invertebrate diversity as well, also super neglected. But what we're dealing with, right, is this very real consequence. If you don't protect something, it's going to likely go extinct before you even get to, in the case of fungi, describe the species, right? So we're dealing with, I think this is, in the scientific sense, this is all quite material. Okay, so thank you all so much. I think I'm going to stop there. I really appreciate your time. I'm happy to take questions. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific. And you got a lot of big shout outs in the chat. Let's see, I just want to read one of them from Alan Perper, who said, "What fascinating connections Dr. Kaishian is making. I had no idea how their talk would go, but I have many questions for myself where I thought I had answers. Thank you." I thought that was a great comment. Well, let's open it up. Oh, Anna, bravo, excellent. Who please come on the camera if you want to ask a question. Yeah, it's always great to see faces. And while people are doing that, I guess I'll lead it off. It's interesting to me. So I think about brains a lot, and like how do our brains work, and being aware that the stories we tell about our brains are probably centered in like a very specific time and place. I'm wondering, if you think that these binaries that just seem to, these extremes and binaries that just seem to come into every part of our culture, whether it's like science or gender or all of these things, do you think that is something innate to us? Obviously you could say, it makes things simpler, but or are we capable, or do you feel that like we're capable of more? And I guess the other part of my question is, the mycophobia versus, I don't know if you want to call it mycophilia, but the kind of search for savior in mushrooms. Like, I think that you could see that for psilocybin, I think people are really looking for panacea for all of the trauma and all of the really terrible things that are happening to people, and all of the illness that people are living with, and wanting an answer, wanting something that will fix everything. Same with the mycoremediation. We've done a lot of damage, and we want a quick fix. And so I guess that those two extremes as well, I'm wondering, like, is that, do you think that's just how we think? Is there space in between? And if so, what would that space look like? And are we capable of it? Sorry, bad question. But
no, it's not a bad question. Thank you. Thanks so much. So I mean, of course, I've only lived this one life, and in this current body, so I don't,
as far as
yeah, but as far from what my understanding of this question of, like, I do think that so when I say our culture, I'm born and raised in the United States, right? Is very binary. It is a binary, and this is also related to science. So science incentivizes binary thinking in a way, and it's not it's not a bad thing inherently. It's powerful to be able to create distinction and talk about it in a way that's standardized. And it's how we could invent vaccines. It's how we could understand that, like, the atom, right? These are things that through a process of scientific investigation that was very linear and targeted and specific, and clearing out what we're talking about, what we're not talking about, and drilling down in such a this process of excavation is really powerful, and it's not inherently bad. So it's a way of sort of making sense of the world. But what happens is when you assign just like moral value to all of the ways in which you're categorizing. So like when you create, okay, this is normal cognitive behavior. This is abnormal. This is bad. You have a disease and a pathology, and you should be, at worst, like locked away or something terrible, right? Or, medicated in a way that's like not actually helpful to you, or not about your experience, but about how you're perceived by others, right? So this is where it gets, when you start to like use science in this way that is then affecting the autonomy and the capacity for other people or other beings to exist freely in the world, or exist as supported and comfortable, right? And so I think that we as a society have, and as a culture and and Western philosophy, it really prioritizes linear thought, and linear thinking is a way that shows up all throughout Christian iconography, Christian sort of organizational systems, farming, agriculture, and industrialization and capitalism. All of these things have like very linear sort of frameworks that they're situated on. Whereas other cultures are like more embedded in these sort of multiple, like layered ways of interaction that don't seek to necessarily separate and define, but sort of move in more circular web-like ways of thinking. So I one time was able to study Chinese medicine in Western China. And for that, part of that experience involved me reading this book called The Web That Has No Weaver. And it's about sort of like the understanding of like the traditional Chinese medical understanding of the body as being an ecosystem, a web that is, you can't really find the beginning of, you can't find the end of, and that has, of course, no weaver, right? So it's not, it's sort of this interrelated way of thinking, which is actually really similar to ecological thinking. And ecology is this like sort of, is of course a branch of science that seeks to understand the relationships between living beings and their abiotic environment, and encourage us to think, in ways that are very circular, interconnected, and sort of actually at times counter to the more clean sort of processes that we expect from like other areas of biology, including our Western medical model. So when it comes to like psychedelic, for example, I think I have incredible enthusiasm for the potential and the possibility, and I can speak from my personal experience of it being a really tremendously powerful medicine that has helped me process all sorts of difficult things. But I also, but it's not going to solve our it's not going to end, mass incarceration. It's not going to stop police brutality. It's not going to end, the climate crisis. These things are, have to, maybe that could be a tool for people doing community work, or I think it should be part of our toolkit, but it's not something that's just going to like everyone takes it and we all live happily ever after. These systems that we're embedded in are, and the conditioning that we have towards domination, towards extractivism is really, really, really deep. And so I think was there another component to your question?
No, that you for okay. My question was wandering and you managed to really nail it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, you have a couple questions, folks who are raising their hands. Is it Ayla or Isla? Do you want to?
Yes, that's Isla. Well,
hey, yeah, Ayla, I know you. Okay, great.
I have the privilege of having a name that starts with A.
I told you to ask a question, so I'm so glad you're asking a question. Didn't I tell you that when you were here for the book party? I said, please ask questions.
Sure, thank you. That was my motivation. This is a fascinating talk, and I really appreciate it. So I'm going to approach as an economist here. And so this is not a new idea, but it's getting sort of framed in a sort of more powerful way by Robert Shiller. Being a Nobel Prize recipient is definitely making it easy. Narrative economics. So it's basically how you frame matters a lot in terms of getting the attention and recognition and sort of like going forward.
Mhm.
And he has a couple papers now writing, and I feel like this is such a powerful concept, and it kind of squarely fits into your framework. And I highly encourage sort of linking the two together. And
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting because like we as economists had our sort of way of reckoning with the 2008 crisis and definitely what's going on with COVID in this concept of recognizing stakeholders. It has always been focused on shareholders, where the objective function is maximizing the shareholder value, but there has been a reckoning. So it's apparently not working. That framework is not working. So we need to consider the stakeholders. And I agree with you. This is the sort of thought leaders in that framework are definitely not white males. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with them, but it's just, again, stereotyping. And it is taking a sort of foothold and I believe, to the benefit of the society. So I feel like this is the perfect moment to push sort of this framework about the science. And I mean, in the field, again, I'm an economist, but sort of recently I've been interested in sort of like how the biology field has expanded, especially with respect to the vaccines. And there's a phenomenal sort of, I don't know, work that I have read with respect to cholera, how the cholera sort of vaccine has been developed and how it was actually on the wrong path because it was the dominant view. I mean, clearly science, just like any other one, the dominant view kind of crushes any criticism. We have science works with peer review, but it's very difficult to sort of advocate for that brand new perspective. There's a lot of pushback, crushing it down. And I really appreciate the talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'd love to check out Robert Schiller's work. Thank you for the recommendation. And just a really quick add on to what you're saying there about just the dominant view, like the and medicine and whatnot. But yeah, it can be really, it's fascinating. Like once something becomes sort of established as canon in science, any attempts to sort of challenge that or becomes not just necessarily an affront to that specific idea, but an affront to science itself, right? And then you're seen not only as sort of just someone who's criticizing a popular idea, but someone who's sort of undermining the authority of science, which is, that's not where we want to be, I think, as a field. But thanks so much for coming and for your comments. Yeah.
Sure.
And then I think
Zay, yeah.
Zay?
Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Patricia. I really appreciated your talk. I guess I was more interested about your South American trip and the community building that y'all did with your work. So I'm just wondering, what should scientists be doing to build that grassroots support and meet these intersectional points to help
That's a great
strengthen our communities?
Yeah, so I would say that, so I just want for that trip, I came into a project that has partnerships with the Indigenous community. So I actually can't speak to that so much because I was sort of invited along as a scientist, and I wasn't on the ground forming those partnerships. But as I do know, I believe that, and I don't know because I didn't attend the talk that Rue Vandegrift gave a few years ago, but I was told it's recorded through the club, and I think he's probably would have spoken to that a little bit. There's also a documentary that he's producing about the project called Marrow of the Mountain, which will explore, it really features the women in the community that we were supporting with our work. And so you could learn, I could maybe, or Annie, maybe could you is there a way you could drop the link to Marrow of the Mountain?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think if you just Google that. But anyway, one thing that I think is really important is just doing, so I've kind of pivoted away from doing work in Central and South America because I don't have ancestral ties there. And I do have such ties in Armenia, in West Asia, which is a country that's incredibly tiny and constantly, my family survived a genocide there. And unfortunately, that is not just a thing of the past, it's like an active conflict in the region. So I felt that it was more, it was probably the best use of my efforts and time and sort of to collaborate with people who I have ancestral ties to. I think that for me, that was the most like straightforward way to leverage the privileges that I have as being an American citizen. I'm not saying that you can't collaborate across ethnic groups or anything like that. Of course you can, but I felt that, so the work that I'm doing within the group of Armenian mycologists is one that feels I think most aligned to my values and most I think least problematic. It's a little bit tricky. This is actually be great to have a longer form conversation about it. I don't want to go off the rails too much, but I would say that my advice is to form place-based partnerships, mostly to figure out who in your immediate community you can support and how can you leverage your skills as a scientist to support them. So for example, if you know a lot about fungi, one thing you could possibly do is, like, there are constantly all around the country, struggles for protection of indigenous land or to return land to indigenous peoples. Part of what can be done is sort of like surveying those lands for rare fauna or fungi and advocating for their protection and using sort of multiple channels to sort of protect the land itself, right? And as just another way of saying, like, this shouldn't be developed, this should be conserved. Here are these rare plants. I mean, of course, a lot of the fungi haven't been evaluated for their status, so you can't actually do it so much with fungi, but you could basically be doing using iNaturalist to say this rare plant was found, this has federal protections, or this animal, whatever. You can kind of use those skills to support efforts that are social in nature. Another thing that I haven't done yet, but I'm going to start working on is doing like air quality testing in public housing. So for looking for the presence of molds that are harmful to human health, and using that as like a way to argue that the housing needs more investment. So there's just sort of all sorts of ways that you can, you have a specific skill set, you live in a community of some sort, they have, communities have needs, figuring out exactly where your skill set is and how it can sort of ally itself to the interests of the vulnerable people around us. So I mean that's a quick answer. I think there's a lot of, I think so many of these things are very nuanced and specific to the context, so it's hard to give super general answers. But I guess the other thing, just thinking about my work in Armenia, like, one of the things that we're explicit about is that we know that colonialism and biodiversity are correlated, like, negatively. So with colonialism, we see a decline in biodiversity, and this is true like all around the world, right? So to us, this idea of like, you can't really separate protecting biodiversity from colonialism. And these things are, because these things are linked. So for us, we're just very explicit about, we're scientists, but we're really explicit about the social dimension to our work, because we don't believe that there's really a point at this point in time in just moving forward with science alone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming.
Well, I want to be cognizant of the time, but I also, maybe we can, do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, I think we can. I see that Andy and Yana have their hand raised, and then I also saw one, maybe I'll get to and those guys in a second. Then I just saw one in the chat, which was about from Alan Perper. Can you describe what you meant by the need to use other perspectives aside from science and our quest to know and understand our world? So one of the other perspectives would be, sort of traditional ecological systems, knowledge systems. Within that, some people are assert and advocate that traditional ecological knowledge is science. I think that conversation has been a little flattened at times, and it requires a lot of nuance. As I mentioned, as a student of Dr. Kammerer's, I've learned to see traditional ecological knowledge as something that is often complementary to science and has a lot of overlap with science, but is not inherently the same thing always. There's elements of science that are in traditional ecological knowledge systems. There's also other dimensions to that. There are more spiritual dimensions. There are so place-based connections that sort of blend biological knowledge with cultural knowledge. And so the ones that, I think to be deferential to traditional ways of knowing is something that I advocate scientists, whether or not we can validate all of the the goal of science shouldn't be to fact check all the traditional ecological knowledge, right? It should just be to be humble and maybe recognize that we don't know everything, and to see how can we learn from other, how can we kind of put down our tools for a moment and listen and invite our bodies into this practice of sort of experiencing the world. So if you haven't already read her works, I couldn't recommend them more. So yeah, then Andy and Iana.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I was just basically wondering about some of the species you've described, the labules, because they're not an order that I know that much about, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about what was the most interesting or exciting for you of the novel species that you discovered.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for asking. Hard to say. I mean, it's just kind of cool. So a lot of mushrooms that macro fungi, we have probably, even if they're new to science, someone's probably seen them before. But what's kind of cool about these labules is there's a really high chance that when I look at some of them, no human has witnessed them before. And that's because some of the fungi I've studied are growing on these really rare water strider insects that live in a bromelia that lives in the Ecuadorian Andes, at this really high elevation. And just and you need a microscope to see it. So just the kind of feeling of wow, this tiny thing has been on this billion-year journey, evolutionary journey on this planet with us. And I think I might be the first person who got to see it and behold it, right? And I think it's really fat. It just blows my mind continuously. I like to make this joke to my students. I make it very clear that I'm joking, but the more I study evolution and the more I read about evolution and think about it and teach about it, the less real it feels. It almost seems, it's so magical. It's so crazy. The fact that for billions of years, this organism was quietly evolving, and it has its own little uniqueness that makes it a species. And it has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with any human. It would have very, very likely would have existed whether or not humans ever evolved. It probably predates, this group of fungi emerged sometime in the Devonian period, 420 million years ago. So it just kind of makes you feel really small as a person, which I find to be actually comforting. The feeling of imagining yourself and embedding yourself, locating yourself in this sort of the tree of life is an act of, it's an act of a it's a perspectival shift that helps you see that you're really just one of many, but in this way that then feels so comforting and possible. So I think it's not so much a strict biological fact that I have to share about them but that act, I think, of getting to witness that is something that stands out to me.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming and for asking.
Well, I just love to hear the way you were talking about them and being the person to see them, because it really made me think of awe. And I think for me, a big part of my practice in community science is awe.
Yes.
And it's kind of a cool way of being, and it's
totally magical. I recommend, that's one of my fundamental like teaching goals is to help create as much like moments of awe as possible, and help people, as you say, cultivate a practice of that. It's really good for your mental health, and it's a great thing that psychedelics do also. And and you can like find ways of recreating it even after after a psychedelic experience as well, but it's one thing, it can help bring that to the fore. So thank you all
This was
so much.
terrific. Yeah, thank you so much. And you know, I'm sure we probably could have more questions all night, but this was really great. We'll have to have you come back for tell us about the Labouls more, because we got a lot of folks who love tiny things. And also for your book. Really
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
That'd be awesome. If anyone wants to send me a message or something to follow up, feel free to shoot me an email, or you can follow me on Instagram or something. Yeah, so feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And thanks to everybody for coming and for your input. It was great.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Okay, great. Take care. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.